Hey guys, it's Thursday, which means it's another edition of Starting Out Solitary with your favorite weird Midwesterner. So this week we've been talking a lot about geographical spirituality, I guess is what I'm gonna call it. And I've kind of watched everybody else's videos because I'm a little torn on the subject. And here's what I mean by that. As someone who practices Cometicism, Native American spirituality, and a few haberdashery of other things without combining them, which is why I don't call myself eclectic, because each practice stays within its own little narrow passageway, I guess. Also, as someone who is consistently working with the plants and the wildlife around me, I find a drastic difference not only in countries between, for example, Corvus in Spain or all our collaborators in Australia, but I find huge differences even in the nuances of American spirituality, paganism, whatever you want to call it. For instance, Lippy lives in Washington, and even though there are a lot of European-based plants that were brought over when the United States was colonized, there are a lot of things that just grow naturally, and that's going to be drastically different from Washington to where I live on the Kansas-Missouri border, and even further down. I spent a lot of time in Arkansas, and even the wildlife between where I live in Arkansas, which is about 5 hours, is very, very different. Like there are subspecies to flowers, and they do different things than are what are generally considered their medicinal spiritual properties in Kansas City, which is where I live. So for me, it's constantly reaching out and learning different things. So I tend to be one that marries science and spirituality a lot. And something that Corvus touched on yesterday is that genetically there are certain things that we're drawn to, and the land has certain resonance for certain things. With DNA testing being at a huge peak of popularity currently, generally your DNA only can accurately go back 6 generations. I think it's 185 ancestors, I think is what it is. And at 6 generations, you're at 224. So you're missing some of those ancestral traits. And there's a huge kind of conversation happening in the science world about DNA memories, or DNA memory fragments, where certain fragments of memory from your ancestral DNA is passed on if it's in your DNA. It gets really complex. So let's get back to kind of the different places. So obviously fauna and flora are going to change, even something, and this is something odd. So when I moved here, I noticed that there is a large increase in gray squirrels, and where I was raised, there were almost no gray squirrels and all fox squirrels, and that's only about 70 miles. So even in that 70 miles, a predominant tree mouse, for all intents and purposes, drastically changes. And so I think even if we don't notice like large shifts, because there are a lot of similar creatures. I mean, you're going to find deer everywhere, and you're going to find ladybugs, and you're going to find, there are things that you're going to find everywhere. But just like I said earlier, the subspecies that you find. So I find that with the vastness that is the United States, there are so many small nuances in how an individual practitioner kind of works things without consciously acknowledging the differences between the places. There's also a vast difference for people who are very highly into celestial bodies, because that constantly changes based on where you are. For instance, the Kemetic holiday of Wapet Rompet happens at the Hellenic Rising of Sirius. Now, what the Hellenic Rising of Sirius is in, we'll say, Karnak, Egypt, is drastically different than what it is going to be in Joliet, Illinois, which is where Kemetic Orthodoxy has its primary temple. So they base theirs off of the Hellenic Rising in their own personal backyard, which is in Illinois, instead of it being at Karnak or Luxor or anything like that. So just the timeline shifts from when the sun peaks in the sky in the east and what sets in the west is going to drastically change from Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea to Hawaii. It just is. It's going to be something that we know it's there, but I don't think we take a lot of time to appreciate that someone that's born, we'll say at 11 o'clock Eastern time, is born at the same. There are other people that are born at the same time in Central. So that plays in to their astrological signs, and that plays into their natal charts. So even born at the exact moment, their charts are going to be different. Just small nuances, which completely changes how that person perceives things. And I think pretty much everyone has touched on it this week. The huge difference and the most notable difference is between the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere, and kind of the changing of the seasons and how that works. And that's a huge variable for everyone. And so when I first started my path, I read both northern and southern hemisphere things because I wanted to find what worked for me, and kind of where my own ebbs and flows in my personal life and my spiritual life kind of connected. In fact, one of my favorite, and I might butcher her name because it's been a long time since I've seen her book, but one of my favorite authors when I first started this path was Fiona Horn, who was huge in the 90s in Australia. So, and there were a lot of things that I picked up from Fiona that a lot of Northern Hemisphere authors weren't talking about. And even finding like books from the UK and Spain, there are a lot of books that we don't necessarily have access to in the United States, whether they don't ship to the United States or whatever. Just the way that certain things are talked about, or this slang that's used within our small subcultures, it's just something that's continuously evolving. And I think as we become more expanded and more interconnected as a whole across the world, I think those lines become more gray and more blurred. Obviously we can't change night and day, and we can't change the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, but all of the other things throughout the entirety of spirituality are always malleable, and you can always choose to hold on to something or let it go. And that's something that we've talked about a lot in this channel. And I think as we become more connected, again, like with our collab, we have Inspiring Alien, we have Australia represented, we have Spain represented, I think we have Brussels represented. There are 2 of us in the US, maybe 3. It's hard to keep track, there are a lot of us. But we have kind of a melting pot, to steal the term, of all these different pathways that are colliding together and exchanging ideas. And it's not always the idea that bashes you over the head that morphs your beliefs or your perspective. And so it's interesting to learn from the other collabers, as well as kind of explore these pathways myself and figure out, what's mine? What did I inherit from my native ancestors? What did I inherit from my Creole ancestors? What did I inherit from my Swedish ancestors, my European ancestors, my Welsh ancestors? And I mean, you can go down that path as long as you want. But at the end of the day, we're all connected, even if it's in a distant way. It's a giant web. We're all relative to everyone else, even if it goes back millennia. Again, going on a DNA rant here, we can all be tracked to haplogroups, and I think there are 12 haplogroups, 13 haplogroups. So, I mean, it's always interesting to kind of take a dip in the pool, I guess, so to speak, with other countries and other practices, and kind of meld those into a new practice. I mean, even though there are 5,000 colors for pagan spirituality, even other spiritual practices have taken over the centuries different things from the areas that they are. They've taken color, they've taken slang, they've taken fairy tales and morphed those into a new spiritual practice. So what's interesting to me is thinking about what will spiritual practice look like in 100 years, in 200 years. At that point, how interconnected are we? Where will the borrowing of spiritual precepts come from? I mean, will they still be using knowledge from the 1700s, from field guides and people who in the United States went through the Lewis and Clark expedition and the things that they took, and then the naturalists that came after them? What will we take of traditional medicine from the immigrants? How will the immigrants that Europe are taking on, or Australia is taking on, that are coming from all over the world, change the way that we perceive spirituality? So these are just some thoughts. I'd love to know what you guys think in the comment section below, and I will see you guys next Thursday.